Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to talk about the literary term character foils and show you some examples specifically from the play Hamlet. Now, the term character foil actually comes from the gemstone making tradition, where you take a piece of bright foil underneath a gem, and this would help to shine it and sort of better show its qualities because it would reflect up on it. Now, this applied to literature is where authors will create characters who are a contrast to other in by some way. In other words, a character foil is going to help by either degree or contrast to highlight specific traits of the protagonist. The same way that that piece of foil under the gem is going to highlight the characteristics of that particular gemstone. So character foils are used for either comparison or contrast. When it's a contrast, you have characters who are opposite, but when it's a comparison, you may have characters who have similar traits, but they differ by degree. So in other words, you may have one character who is strong, but the protagonist is going to seem even stronger by comparison. So if we apply this to some characters you may be familiar with, you can think of Simba and Mufasa from The Lion King. They both have similar traits. I mean, they're obviously both lions and they're obviously both going to be rulers, but when you put them side by side, you see exactly how much bigger and stronger Mufasa is and just how tiny Simba is at this point. So they're not opposites, but each one of them seems either bigger or smaller because they're next to each other. And it's that contrast, that comparison between them that helps to show, then highlight this characteristic by degree. Now, when character foils are used as opposites, it's almost like a mirror. They're set up and they reflect back and sometimes even magnify each other's traits. So I'm going to show you a couple of character pairs, and I want you to think about how the characteristics of one person make the other person's traits stand out even more just because they're placed together and side by side in a story. So instead of Mufasa and Simba, now consider Mufasa and Scar. Now you have two very opposite sorts of characters. Or consider perhaps Voldemort and Harry Potter from the Harry Potter series, where these two are set up in opposition to each other, but they do become character foils because of the traits that they share in common. But by putting them next to each other, you can really see the differences in both characters. Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker are another set of character foils. Again, they're placed in contrast to each other, and you can see their similarities, but because they're side by side, their differences are also magnified. So remember, character foils are not always direct opposites. Sometimes the contrast is to show specific qualities in each character, not necessarily good or bad, like not necessarily one's really good character and one's a really bad character. But because these characters are side by side, you notice their characteristics even more. So you might find characters who are thoughtful next to someone who's more impulsive, a character who's introverted next to someone who's extroverted, someone who may be strong at math versus someone who's strong at writing, maybe someone who has this huge family unit and someone who's an independent loner. But because these two are placed side by side, the author is trying to show you something more specific about each one of them. So here's a few examples from recent culture or popular culture that you may be familiar with. So to take the Twilight series, Team Jacob versus Team Edward. Obviously, you had two characters who were both not necessarily opposites, but they had some distinct differences. And because they were side by side, those differences were magnified. So there's a great example of a character foil. Or take Kirk and Spock from the Star Trek series. Again, they're not opposites, but you notice how much more logical Spock is because he's placed to the much more emotional and impulsive Captain Kirk. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson make a classic pair of character foils from past literature and obviously from more recent movies as well. Or again, pulling from the Star Wars series, if you set up Luke next to Darth Vader, you have a series of character foils who are in contrast to each other and they're opposites. But you could put Han Solo next to Luke Skywalker, and you still have a pair of character foils, but they magnify each other's traits. In this case, the fact that Luke Skywalker is so much more young and inexperienced, Han Solo is sort of the loner and the guy who's ready to go out there and do the work that needs to get done kind of fit. So by creating these two characters next to each other, you create this kind of reflection and help to understand each other's characteristics a little bit more specifically. For those of you who had a chance to see our senior production of The Importance of Being Earnest, might have noticed the characters of Gwendolyn and Cecily, who are great examples of character foils. And we will be reading this play later on in the course as well. Or from the Hunger Game movies, Katniss and Prim are also great examples of character foils. Again, they're not opposites, but you notice how much more strong and ready to jump into things Katniss is by putting her next to Prim, who's a little sweeter and a little more innocent, needs a little bit more protection. So the idea again is that the author is trying to set these characters up, and because they're next to each other, you notice their own individual characteristics even more. If you've ever watched the television show Pretty Little Liars, all of the main characters there act as foils for each other. Each one of them has their own unique sort of take and perspective and style and reactions to things, and each one of them helps to illustrate the other people's characteristics because of the way that they're set up in comparison to each other. So in conclusion, a character foil is something that an author creates when you have two characters that are placed side by side. It helps to show us each one of the characters' traits a little bit more clearly. It can create some depth and subtlety in each one of the characters and can set up either opposite characters or degrees of equality. And it basically helps the reader to better understand the protagonist, the antagonist, or even the minor characters in the story. And that's the end of What is a Character Foil?